Welcome everyone to this webinar entitled Decolonizing Global Health in Africa. It's an extremely big honor for me personally to moderate this session, this conversation with such an eminent cast of experts and eminent personalities in their fields, in their own right, but also particularly in the area of global public health. They have very strong views, they have expert views, they have insights that you will probably not hear in many places when it comes to this particular thematic area. Even before we dive deeper, I'm going to share with you their bios one by one as I give them the floor. But before we get there, allow me to just mention a couple of things that will help us all participate efficiently. Now, the first thing is, please note that this event is being recorded. So by being here, by participating, you are confirming your willingness to be recorded. And then we also invite you to kindly use the chat function to put across any questions or comments forward as the hosts are making their submissions. And then ourselves, we will do our best to keep up with the questions. And also you have the option to raise your hand because currently everyone is muted. And during the Q&A session, or even as the event is going on, please do raise your hand if you have a specific question or comment. And then we'll be able to take as many of your comments as possible. We have obviously put in place measures to maintain the integrity of this meeting. However, if ever there is a disturbance, if for some reason there is a disconnection or some technical issue, do please bear with us. But what I recommend is all the panelists who are still connected should continue with the conversation. For example, if by some mishap I happen to drop off the call. So this is really a conversation for all of us, and we wouldn't let technology in any shape or form hamper us from having the exciting conversation we're about to have. Now, this is a collaborative effort between the Numa Group. Numa Group is a Pan-African integrated communications and consulting firm that works with organizations from across the region, from across the world on various topics and on various endeavors and projects. And we are very delighted to be collaborating with the Global Health Decolonization Movement in Africa, GHDM Africa. And obviously, I wouldn't forget to mention that GHDM Africa is a fast-growing network of African citizens who have come together to constructively agitate for the decolonization of global health practice in Africa. And this is very important. You will see why I insisted on that word constructively later on. Now, this particular webinar is the first in a series that seeks to bring to the surface the various manifestations of coloniality in global health. And that may include racism, saviorism, epistemic violence, just to mention a few. And today you will be hearing, as I said earlier, from an amazing cast of practitioners in the global health arena. That is Dr. Lioba Hirsch. Maybe Dr. Hirsch, you can just wave to everyone. Thank you. And we are also going to hear from Dr. Catherine Showutungi. I hope I correctly pronounced your name. So Dr. Showutungi, please wave to everyone. And then we are going to also hear from Dr. Mosoka Fala. And kindly do wave to us, Dr. Fala. You can activate your camera. There you go. So everyone, you have seen our stellar cast of panelists. In terms of program, we are going to start off with a very strong keynote by Dr. Hirsch. and I'm going to be referring to you as Lioba. I hope you'll agree for me to do that. And then thereafter, Dr. Chiwetungi and Dr. Fala, you are going to come in and share your insights, really, as far as this particular issue is concerned. So, without further ado, allow me to just get us started. And I had initially planned that I will do individual introductions at the same time at the beginning, but allow me to do so sequentially as they intervene. So I will start with you, Lioba. So Dr. Lioba Hirsch is a research fellow at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She's a qualitative and archival researcher with an interest in the colonial and anti-Black entanglements of Western biomedicine and global health management. Her research has focused on the historical development, contemporary management, and colonial aftermath of British health interventions in West Africa. She holds a PhD in geography and global health from the University College London, a master's in political sociology from the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a bachelor's in political sciences from Sciences Po Paris. Obviously, this is not even close to doing justice to the profile of and the body of work of Dr. Hirsch. But this gives you an idea of how lucky we are to have such an eminent speaker to start us off with a keynote presentation. So, Lioba, whenever ready, please do share your slides and do share with us anything that you feel I have omitted. Obviously, I have omitted so much, but maybe you can tell us a secret that will, scandalize everyone. That will make it.
I'm not sure if I can tell you a secret that will scandalize everyone, but I will try. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure and a privilege, really, and to be a guest of the NUMA group and of the Decolonizing Global Health Movement Africa. As I said in the brief first meeting, the preparation meeting, this is the first time, shockingly, that I'm invited to speak and that I have the privilege to speak to issues of decolonizing global health in Africa. And so I think this is a really, really important meeting and hopefully the first of many constructive, as you said, and thought generating and provoking discussion. So what I'm going to do, thank you also so much for your very generous introduction, which fully did me justice and probably exaggerated some of my academic exploits. As Gilbert said, I'm a research fellow at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, although I will shortly be moving on to a lectureship at the University of Liverpool, while still focusing on issues of decolonizing global health and health geographies. I'm a German Togolese researcher. I grew up in Germany and in France. And again, as such, I think it's really important for me to thank you for having me as a member of the African diaspora. I definitely identify as African, but I'm also aware of my many privileges and I guess the politics of positionality that have shaped my life of growing up in Europe, although I have spent considerable time in Africa during my adult life. But I feel like I'm very much here as a guest, and again, I thank you for having me. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to give a very brief presentation. I don't know if keynote isn't too grand a word, but I thought I'd give some context about what I think the problem is historically and why we are all here and why I think this is a really important discussion to be had. So I'll speak about the history of global health and colonialism, and then I will share some thoughts about what I think the problem in global health management is nowadays. So to start us off, a brief history of global health. I think the first thing to bear in mind is that at least in Europe, or in a European context, which still dominates global health, international global health institutions, when we speak about global health, we really speak of Western and Western biomedical understandings of health, rather than African or other indigenous forms of health and understandings of medicine. And I think that's really important to understand, because that gives us an insight into the width of the problem and its complexity. Western understandings of health and biomedicine were spread across the globe through colonial officers and missionaries. And colonial medicine had three main goals. The first one was to support medical and scientific advances in Europe. And an example of that is this photo I took at an exhibition in Germany a few years back about German colonialism in Africa. And this is a map of Robert Koch. He was one of the, I guess, the founders of bacteriology and microbiology, really, and he had a sleeping sickness camp in Tanzania, which at the time was a German colony. And so what Koch did, and what a lot of European scientists did during the colonial era is that they used African subjects and colonized populations in order to study diseases, to trial and research treatments, etc. So this is one example of how colonialism and biomedicine from the very beginning had a very close and very violent relationship in regards to Africa and African populations. The second aim was to protect the health of European colonizers. And the third one was to, and this in a way was the most important one at the time, was to make colonial rule more cost efficient. My research predominantly focuses on Sierra Leone and on West Africa. And Sierra Leone and the rice coast of West Africa were referred to by the British as the white man's grave, for instance, due to the very high mortality of European colonial officers in the region at the time. And so one of the aims of biomedicine was to reduce that mortality rate, to make colonial rule more cost efficient and more efficient overall. Earliest European health interventions in formerly colonized countries were colonial, and they were linked to notions of white European supremacy. So colonialism, obviously, and I think this sometimes isn't focused on enough. Colonialism was a deeply racist endeavor, and it firmly placed white Europeans at the top of the perceived human hierarchy, and this also came through in health interventions in Africa. Imperialism and colonialism very often disrupted local disease ecologies, leading to big epidemics. And one example of that is the sleeping sickness epidemic in Tanzania around the turn of the 20th century. And another one is that of tuberculosis in South Africa, also at the beginning of the 20th century, linked to mining. And so while we had a very high mortality rate of European colonizers and a lot of researchers focus on that, we had an even higher mortality rate of indigenous and African populations. And again, I think that's something that we don't focus on enough. Biomedicine and colonialism were also entangled in the sense that earliest disease interventions in Africa focused very heavily on infectious diseases, and then later on nutrition and child mortality. And I'd be happy to explain how that links to colonialism later on if there's interest. Health infrastructures that were put in place in Africa were also linked to exploitation. And this is from Walter Rodney's, these numbers are from Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. So in the 1930s in Nigeria, there were 4,000 Europeans and they had access to 12 hospitals compared to 40 million Nigerians who had access to 52 hospitals in total. So you see the beginning of inequalities in health infrastructures themselves. Across the British Empire, medical careers were barred to non-white colonial subjects, and I'm not as familiar with other colonial endeavors, but I would venture a guess that this was the same for German, French, Belgian, or Portuguese or Spanish colonialism as well, which effectively made it impossible for a great number of Africans to enter into medical careers. Hospitals were racially segregated and they were subject to different standards of care. So the 12 hospitals reserved for Europeans, you can take a guess that they had much higher standards of care and equipment and infrastructure than the 52 hospitals dedicated to the 40 million Nigerians. And finally, I would argue that colonial interventions really lay the basis for current health inequalities, both in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of I guess, advances in biomedicine and the impact that Africans can have on the development of biomedicine, because we were barred from practicing it for so long. And until quite recently, really, if you think about it. As I said, colonialism was a deeply racist endeavor, and this racism crystallized and came out really strongly in medicine and in colonial medicine itself. And these are just two quotes that I want to read to you that illustrate the deeply racist nature of colonial and medical interventions in Africa. The first one is from Patrick Manson, who's by many seen as the founder of tropical medicine. He's the founder of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where I work at the moment. And he said this during a speech delivered in London in 1912. The European cannot, as a rule, live and thrive in tropical Africa as he can in India and China, for example. So here again, we see that hierarchy even within the colonies of Africa being at the bottom. Therefore, to induce the ordinary European to cast his lot there, even for a short time, he demands special advantages, more pay, less work, liberal furloughs. Indeed, the latter are necessary conditions of his being able to live there at all. And I would argue that that's still the case with a lot of expats working in health in Africa. They get extra money to make up for having to move to Africa, so to speak. And this was the most important problem our government had to face in dealing with its new African possessions. It was an economic one: how to govern and exploit, or rather develop, a poor, unhealthy country, and at the same time to preserve its solvency. And again, really interesting here how colonial exploitation and development, the discourse of development, sort of like come together. The second quote is by Andrew Balfour, who worked in Sudan for, I think, around 15 years for the Wellcome Bureau of Investigation, which was funded by what's now the Wellcome Trust, a big health funder. And this is from a paper he wrote in 1926 called Acclimatization of the White Man in the Tropics. And there he wrote, what we have to ask ourselves is, can white men live and work and breed and in the true sense colonize the tropics if these regions are freed from disease? In other words, do tropical climatic conditions and what we may call the general conditions of life in the tropics present an insuperable barrier to the white man making a permanent home therein, and to his descendants exhibiting that bodily and mental vigor, which at the present day is a special characteristic, a hallmark, as it were, of the Caucasian races. So again, racism was very, very prevalent in these discourses. Now, just very briefly, what does global health look like today, and why do I think that looking at history actually is really important in order to understand the present? These are two slides from the Global Health 50/50 report, the 2020 report, which was published in late 2019. And this just gives an idea of the geography of global health leadership. Where do global health leaders nowadays come from? As you can see, 17% of global health leaders come from low and middle income countries, compared to 83% of leaders who come from high income countries. Within those 17%, 5% are women from low and middle income countries. So women are even more underrepresented in this already underrepresented world. And I think even more shockingly, 8% of leaders have degrees, of global health leaders have degrees obtained in low and middle income countries. So in other words, if you don't study at a European university, it becomes incredibly difficult to enter that highest strata of global health management. And incidentally, that's the same number as degrees awarded by Harvard University, which again, I think is deeply problematic. What does global health look like today? Well, again, this and I'm a geographer, so I'm always interested in maps and I guess the spatialization of inequality in relation to health. And again, as you can see, a vast majority of global health organizations have their headquarters in Europe and in North America. And again, Africa is only represented at 7%. And finally, why I think I was invited, and what I want to conclude by saying is really what I guess started saying in a piece I wrote for The Lancet, which was published at the beginning of the year, where I spoke about whether it's possible to decolonize global health institutions. And I think there's a real risk of the decolonizing global health movement replicating colonial dynamics, in the sense that a majority of official conversations, or conversations that receive a lot of attention, take place in North America and in Europe, They often involve people like myself, people who are part of the African diaspora, the Asian diaspora, or the South American diaspora, who don't always have lived experience of actually having grown up in Africa. And while I think there's a space for the diaspora, and I hope that I can be involved, and I want to serve Africa, and I want to do all I can to contribute to a more equitable global health world, I also think that's a problem. The fact that people who are mostly based in North America and Europe are having so much of a say in relation to global health in Africa nowadays. And because of this, I guess, geographic focus on North America and Europe, there's also been a shift in what decolonization means, I think, and I also reflected about this in this piece in The Lancet, and the fact that decolonization has come to mean something highly institutionalized and something that's very polite, and something that we can achieve by all sitting around a table and being polite to one another. And I think, especially in the European context, that's not always the case, because people have never given up power voluntarily or through polite conversation, and I think that's something we need to bear in mind. And then finally, I think it's also really important to reflect on how colonial mindsets have shaped our own ways of thinking. And again, I include myself in that. The education systems that we go through and how they have been shaped. I think the universities that we go to and that we have access to, how global health and medicine and public health are being taught, I think is something that we need to interrogate very closely. And I'm going to stop there because I've gone on for far longer than I ever intended to. I'll stop sharing.
Wow, this is just so powerful, short, but extremely informative. I mean, I'm just flabbergasted. 17% of leaders in the public health space are from LMICs, and then only 5% of those are women.
Yeah.
And then even further, many of these have to have some kind of tie with the West, or with Western schools or Western background. Very, very interesting. And then you also talked about 7% of institutions and organizations in this space, only 7% being found in sub-Saharan Africa. And I think that the last bit that really captured my attention was that last slide where you were talking about how the movement actually risks replicating the colonial dynamics and the colonial power structures, even though it's meant to actually dismantle them and turn them on their heads. But then you mentioned that that's likely to happen because maybe, as we know, people don't give up power very easily. So dismantling and overturning those structures might not be as easy as we think, especially in a context where colonial mindsets are so entrenched, not just in the global South, but also in the developed world. So you've just blown my mind. I mean, I feel like I can now go on TV and be a very good debater on this matter. But I think I still need some strong insights, and for that I would like us to come to you, Catherine. And obviously, I would still like to come back to you, Dr. Hirsch, to just maybe dig deeper on some of the aspects. But and I'm sure we'll have more questions. But Catherine, you had one of the largest organizations on this continent in the area of public health. That is, as the executive director of the African Population and Health Research Center based right here in Nairobi. And maybe before you come in, allow me just to share a brief bio about yourself. So Dr. Catherine Chobutungi, and I'm proud to say that this is a lovely name from the Great Lakes region, the lovely pearl of Africa, Uganda. And Dr. Chobutungi is the executive director of APHRC, as I mentioned, formerly the director of research at the same institution. And you have served in several leadership roles over the past 15 years, so bringing a lot of experience to the table. And also Dr. Chobutungi holds a PhD in epidemiology and a Master of Science in Community Health and Health Management from the University of Heidelberg, as well as a Bachelor of Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery from Makerere University. And in 2018, Catherine was elected as a fellow at the African Academy of Sciences. Wow, very impressive. And in 2019 was selected as a Joy Blanche Chair at the University of Amsterdam. And also she's also a co-director of the Consortium for Advanced Research Training in Africa. So not only is Catherine an eminent personality in this space in Africa, but we can see that global outlook as well. So thank you so much for making the time. Now, allow me just to come in and ask you, as a leader of one of Africa's premier global health research organizations, an organization that prides itself as being African-led and African-based. You also have studied and traveled outside Africa. With that massive profile that you have, Dr. Chibutungi, what are some of the ways that you have experienced coloniality in this paradigm of North-South research partnerships, and perhaps broadly speaking, in the global health arena? And please feel free to tell us a secret about yourself as well.
Okay, thanks so much, Gilbert, for that introduction. And thanks, Dr. Hash, for that amazing, setting the stage. Every time I sit in these kinds of forums where, the history of colonialism and how things, the more things change, the more they stay the same, it's always interesting to realize, how long the past of coloniality is, and perhaps how long the future, of this fight or this movement is going to be. It's always sort of sobering and it's to some extent daunting to realize that this is long standing systems. And so trying to do something about them, we have to be smart in where we start. So I think the question is more about our experiences. And I don't know how much time I have, because I could give a whole lecture about our experiences. But I'll just sort of summarize, some of the manifestations of what we see as these, power imbalances. And I've mentioned this in the past, that when I joined the African Population and Health Research Center as a postdoc, one of the things which struck me at first was there was some kind of realization that there's a difference between a partnership and a consultancy. So when you are approached by a northern partner, potential, to work on some piece of work, you have to ask yourself, is this a partnership or is it a consultancy? Because the most common form of engagement was, we've received $1 million from X funder and we're looking for partners. And my boss at that time impressed it upon me that once the grant has been sourced, once the grant has been awarded, you're no longer a partner, you're a consultant, because partnerships have to do with intellectual property. They have to do with the intellectual input and conceptualization in whatever it is that is going to be done. And several times after, we used to reject money, and at that time we were struggling with money, and we used to be so puzzled at how we could reject money when we are struggling with funding. But that was a principle that was there, and it's a principle that still exists. That some of the ways in which these power imbalances are manifest is being approached to contribute to research that you've not participated in conceptualizing. And many times what that means is that you've been painted with one big brush with many other partners in other countries, and somebody has made a determination of what your contribution is, the value of that contribution, and they've even put a price tag to it. So they'll come to you and say, we're looking for 5 partners in 5 countries, and each partner will receive $100,000. So, you just budget for that. So if you've not had intellectual ownership or intellectual input into this conceptualization, there was no time to discuss what strengths do you bring to the table, what expertise do you bring to the table, what can you contribute to this work? But it has already been predetermined that all the 5 African partners, this is their contribution and it's worth $100,000. So many times what that means is that you're being paid to collect data. And after that, since you didn't contribute to the intellectual conceptualization, data ownership, data access, data use, many times those things are not taken into account. So in the end, African institutions, you don't participate in the intellectual conceptualization, and many times you don't participate in the scientific outputs that come out of these engagements, because $100,000 is unlikely to pay for your time to analyze data and participate in scientific publication. So in a way, it becomes a system that is self-reinforcing. You're struggling for funding, you get a partner, quote unquote, who approaches you, no chance to have really any significant intellectual input into the work. And so even the products that come out of that work, there's no ownership. So over time, your publication records, your profile as a researcher keeps on actually getting diminished. And the partners, their publication records and their profiles as scientists, they keep on sort of getting amplified. So I think it's a self-perpetuating system to a certain extent. And so our experiences are varied. The lack of transparency, there's actually behavior that is outright disrespectful, as I've said, being painted with one simple brush, whether you are in Malawi, in the north of Malawi or the center of Kenya or the south of Nigeria, all of you are getting $100,000. So that is really something which assumes that your contribution can't be anything. It's the same. It doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter who you are, that there's nothing more that you can contribute that is different from somebody else, in a different context. So there are lots of experiences, but I'll first pause because, as I said, I need perhaps an hour to narrate
Wow.
the things we have to deal with. Yes.
You've just blown my mind, and I just have a quick follow-up question. How does that issue of lack of intellectual ownership affect, generally speaking, the work that organizations like yourselves do, but also broadly our countries in their efforts to develop their public health systems?
So as I've said, if you've not participated in the intellectual description or the definition of what needs to be done, and many times the relevance of that piece of work could be questionable. If you have stakeholders, I work in an institution where we tried as much as possible to work with different policy actors. We work with civil society, we work with technocrats in government, we work with parliaments, and many times they have a lot of needs. They say this is something that is important to us, but your ability to address those needs is almost non-existent. And so if you're sort of dependent on this system where you've not built your own profile, you've not built your profile as an individual to attract your own grants independently, then you're sort of continuously dependent. And so many times the work that you're doing, sometimes it's not even part of your mission. Sometimes it's not even part of your priorities. Sometimes it's not part of the national, research priorities or needs. And so as you've rightly said, you keep on doing things because there's money to pay for them. And many times there's no time for you to analyze the data, no time for you to publish. So the work is done, the data goes. Many times there used to be a time when the data would be put on CDs, and then the next person who flew in would go home with the CD. But now there are servers and there are clouds and there's all that. So in real time, the data goes. And sometimes you can't even access the data that you collected, if you're in these kinds of partnerships. So for whom is the research? The research was done in Kenya. Data was collected from Kenyans or from Ugandans. And then the main output that's out of that are papers published by people. Maybe some of them have never been to Kenya. So what happens to the Kenyan Minister of Health as far as this, the value of this research is? So it's, as you've said, there's a way it sort of undermines the system, because in some instances, not all, it's not actually addressing the things that the people who need evidence or who need data are interested in.
Wow! I'm just, I'm out of breath. I'm just thinking about the impact that this has, especially something specific that you mentioned about scientific outputs that actually address the needs of the context of the various country contexts. So I think that the impact is actually quite significant, because we all know that you can't come with a solution to a problem you haven't taken time to diagnose from the perspective of the local context. So if this is being decided and defined elsewhere, obviously, it's going to take time before we truly, at scale, find solutions to African problems or to global South problems that are adapted to specific countries. I would want to dig a bit deeper into that broad brush aspect, whereby organizations from vastly different contexts are brought together, banded together into the same group to solve an issue that hasn't been defined from their context or from their respective context. I can just imagine that this has significant implications. But perhaps before we come back to that discussion, let me just come to you, Mosoka. I was just commenting earlier that you are royally dressed today, and we'll still have that conversation about how I can have access to your stylist. But other than that, Dr. Mosoka Falah, as the Chief Executive Officer of Refuge Place International, based out of Monrovia in Liberia, obviously you have access to a lot of data and you are very involved in the public health space. Actually, what I want to do is to quickly, as I did with others, mention a brief snippet of your bio. You are the founder and CEO at the Refuge Place International, a non-profit organization providing healthcare for poor communities in Liberia. So bringing to us that perspective as an NGO, working on the ground, having many years of experience in the field. In 2017, you were awarded the USAID Liberia Health Worker and Development Person of the Year for your work with Refuge Place. And you're also the co-founder of the community-based initiative Liberia, a non-profit organization providing research services on issues that emanated from the 2014 and 2015 Ebola outbreak in West Africa. We all remember how devastating that was. And also for your work building community level trust in Ebola response. You were named a Time Magazine Person of the Year in 2014. You also hold a PhD in immunology from the University of Kentucky, as well as a master's in public health from the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Extremely impressive profile you have, and you are indeed a distinguished African global health practitioner in that respect. So, and you have studied and worked internationally, but also now you are doing a lot of work on the ground with communities, and whereby you have boots on the ground. And I just wanted to get your perspectives about how the global funding landscape specifically has perpetuated coloniality. We just heard, obviously, some insights from Dr. Hirsch and Dr. Kyobutungi that gave us some good context. But, from your perspective, how does that funding landscape perpetuate coloniality in this field?
Thank you very much, Patrick. The two big things I pick up from the two previous speakers is that one, we have saviorism embedded within the funding is the issue of a big savior saving the Africans, so they should have less to say. If you are a savior, you do not expect much difference of opinion from the person you're trying to save. The saying is that the drowning man will hang on to anything. So that's the mindset they come with. And embedded within the coloniality is the fact that there is always this master-servant relationship. Our masters, some of master think they stay the masters, master in terms of access to research, in terms of ability to manage data, and we are of a lesser being. The one other Patrick Lumumba can say, we are treated as though we are a lesser God. And I will share with you a little bit of my story. Up until recently, I was the Director General of the National Public Health Institute of Liberia. I actually had to build the Public Health Institute. Some of the biggest global health institutions fought me day and night to get me out. And I will give you some examples, some of the ground that I stood up against them. I stood up on many fronts to defend our right as Africans. And whenever you stand up to them, I'm going to propose some solutions. Be ready for the fight. Be ready for them. They will fight you. And the way they fight you, they will connive with the local politicians, and they have the funding they can get at you. Let's start with my own experiences. The issue of co-authorship on papers. I was working on this very big project as the principal investigator of a big research. All of a sudden, I get the draft manuscript of a paper and I was told to read a paper and put my name as a co-author. And I wrote the guys in the West and told them, please do not insult me. I went to school like you. I went to the same school. This is how people write papers. We sit down, we discuss the concept, we have an outline, and each of us will write a portion of the paper. We are equals. So I sent the people back to them. A few weeks later, they apologized and they sent for me to go to the US. I went to the US and we sat down like partners around the table and we published a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. You have to stand up firm. And one thing I want to say to us, sometimes it's a long road, it's a costly road to stand up. Sample removal and analysis, one of the experiences I had. After Ebola, we had thousands and thousands of specimens collected. There were people who came around and said the sample should be taken away from Liberia and taken abroad to be kept for safety. I stood up and said, I do not mind, but we have to set up conditions. One of those conditions, one, Liberia become the owner of the samples. They are never used until Liberia have a clear-cut approval. We track every samples that travel. Whenever analysis have been done, we must have scientists from Liberia to go on the sample. It was a tough experience. One of my worst enemies from one of the big institutions, I won't call it Western institution, tried to manipulate the Minister of Health, and I said to them, it's not possible, it's not going to happen. No samples will leave this country where we have not signed on and we have not agreed upon on the terms and conditions, the order of authorship, the ability to have the African have degrees as a result of any research. We signed the documents, we agreed, the ambassador signed, our minister signed, the samples were taken, they were analyzed. Fast forward, a big university in the US came out and wanted to use some of our sample to test, to verify a rapid diagnostic test for Ebola in the DRC. And they wrote us and said they would give us $30,000 US upfront. They will help us to get some specimen and then we'll buy from them. And I told them 1.5% of whatever RP you get after approval will stay from our country. This is not about me, it's about our children to come. This is the Liberians' blood. We went through the cycle of discussion, they went around all the politicians and I said, this will not be possible. We're not discussing, we're not talking about cash you are going to advance to us. We're talking about things that will stay for our posterity. So I'm giving examples and giving the feedback that I had to do, but it is a longer road because many of us Africans tend to compromise the present for the long future. You will not have many friends to support you, but there are times you must stand up and say, this is right for our continent. That's the way to go. There are examples where we read grants and we are not allowed to be PRs on the grant. I have a good example where I wrote a grant, went to the US, wrote a grant, and I was told that you have not had a prior grant, so you cannot be a PR on the grant. How do I have a prior grant if I don't serve as a PR on this grant that I wrote? So we see these systematic ways in which coloniality manifests itself. And at the bottom of each of these is the funding they get to bring country. And the funding is used to influence policymakers. Policymakers do not have the ability to stand and see the greater need of the country. I will shift a bit and review a couple of papers that have come recently. This is now the bigger Africa context. One of the papers that was published in Nature on April 22nd spoke about Africa trying to start a vaccine industry, that Africa input 99% of all the vaccine. When you read a paper, it will appear like Africa is not serious. That's the reason we are the victim. But just hold on 1 second. I'm going to convince you that attempts are being made by our colonial masters so that we do not build the infrastructure to be able to manufacture vaccine. And that is a paper that was published by Ngozi Orondu and others in Nature on the issue of funding that comes from research in Africa, $30 million for malaria research. An analysis of the $30 million that was given to PAF and 6 other Western organizations applied for the grant, and not a single African country was on that grant. The authors took a step back and looked at 2017. In 2017, $1.1 billion was sent for malaria research in Africa. Of the 1.1 billion, 81% of that went to Western research institutions and universities. 15% of that went to NGOs, Western NGOs, and less than 2% of that money came to Africa. So 1.1 billion, that's what I'm going to say now. How do you build infrastructure with less than 1.1 million, less than 1%? You need funding to be able to build the pool of educated scientists. It takes a long time to train a scientist. You need funding to do that. But the funding is never given to us. We get in this collaboration. For example, I sit on multiple consortium in West Africa. I'm on the malaria consortium. Most of the countries in Africa will have an indirect cost of 8.1% to 15 to 20%, whereas their Western counterpart will have as high as 80% indirect cost. How do you intend to use that? One, to build an infrastructure to train people. There are many Africans in the diaspora who may want to relocate to Africa and do good science work. But let's face the reality, as local African government, we may not have adequate salaries. But the way it's done in the West is from the research, scientists are paid good salaries. Why can, if at all we are serious in this establishment of science in Africa, why can't we make sure that this research grant have a proportion of Africans on the research grant with very competitive salaries? We don't do that. We are giving peanuts, the indirect cost is little. We are struggling to even run the generators in our research institution in Africa because the indirect costs are very little. Many clinical trials are done in Africa every year for vaccines and many diseases. How many of those clinical trials have within that context technology transfer to build the technology in country so that after the clinical trials, we can be able to have something to wait and build upon. Instead, we are just research animals. This research are done, specimens are collected. How many of our training programs will say within every research we produce 1 or 2 PhDs? There are very few and far in between. And obviously, if you cannot produce on the research grant African scientists that will have to be trained up to PhD and postdoc, how do you intend for them to be independent scientists? More besides, we all do know as a young scientist, it takes you around 3 to 4 years to establish your name, publish your papers, and attract grants and build consortium. Many times, many of the graduate with postdoc do not have initial funding from the Western grants to say, okay, you have completed your PhD, your postdoc, you are moving back to Kenya, you are moving back to Malawi. You have the first 3 years of salary support for research so that you can think and develop your research portfolio. So we are running a race that is so uneven. We are running a race where our hands are tied behind our back and our legs are tied, and we are asked to run this race and win this race. And fundamentally, because there's this savior mentality, there's this master-servant mentality, it must continue. We cannot develop research like other countries, so we are staffed, we are never giving enough funding. We get into unequal research projects that give us very little indirect cost to build our infrastructure to train our figure scientists. Eventually, what that does is that we are equally disadvantaged scientifically in the global health space. Even for diseases that are endemic to Africa, when the research comes, we are not making decisions on those diseases. Those are that have the training and the context. We are not able to harness our resources. Even the institutions we build in these countries that are supposed to be supported to become center of excellence are not supported. So basically, we are so disadvantaged in this whole colonial research space, colonial health and global health issue because someone think they are the savior. And if you have a savior mentality, people must always feel in need to come to you. In your mind, you are a savior alone, people are needed. That's one. As long as you are a master, someone must be down, and so it's Africa that has to be down. So this is the thing about it that I've just gone over, and I want to close with, are there examples in Africa? In 2 or 3 minutes. The last time I was in Mali as part of the scientists to look at the malaria research. I have a mentor from the NIH, Dr. Cleveland. They've worked for 25 years in Mali. As I walk around the University of Mali and I look around the various professors, I saw MD, PhD, PharmD, PhD, and I asked them the question. They said, we've been very successful to have a 100% return rate to Mali. I said, how have you succeeded? He said, because in our collaboration, we are written in a grant and supported by the NIH intramural grant. 70% of our funding comes from away, so we can easily come back home to Mali and have competitive salary and do our research. We see that happening as a fact. When we started to analyze the Ebola samples, they will fly people in from the US to come analyze the samples. The first time I went there and saw it, I came back home, I had tears in my eye. These are Liberian blood being analyzed by scientists flying in from the US. That morning, I woke up 2 a.m. and I wrote my advisor. I said, I'm in so much pain in my heart. I said, there are Liberian scientists here. One of those who studied in Tanzania, he has a master's in molecular biology. Yet he's a taxi driver. But we fly in people from the US, put them in an expensive hotel. And I can never forget what he said to me. He said, I feel your pain, go to bed, I will do something about it. And I'm proud to say today we have almost 12 of these young scientists that are now running specimens that we compare to the US, and the concordance of 100%, which means they have the ability to do it, but they never had the opportunity. We must create that ability, and as you can see from my example, we must fight back. Sometimes some favor must be rejected. It's going to be hard and painful. I told you I had a very great job, key position, but I had to say no to some things because we had to fight some of the colonial masters. Just by agreeing to some of the things, even when they are wrong, it reinforced the savior mentality. It reinforced the master-servant mentality. So there's ability for us Africans to come and start this kind of conversation and say how far we can go, how far we can tolerate. We need to rethink the global funding landscape. If you're going to give us funding to sell malaria, maybe give us 30% or 40%. You can't get 1% of the institutions. So I want to stop here and say there is a way, there's hope, but there's about time that we Africans stand up to some of these realities. It will not be comfortable for us, but it's going to, in the long run, for our continent, for our children, protect us better. Thank you very much.
Wow, wow! I literally have goosebumps, Mosoka. That was an absolutely impassionate and detailed and practical insight into this problem. And one of the things I really appreciate, and thank you very much for those insights, is you articulated in very practical terms how the difference can be made in conversations with those, with number one, those trying to perpetrate the saviorism, the coloniality, but also what our own mentality should be. And without trying to summarize what you've said, because it's so heavy and so spot on, I want to come to the next question, and this will be a question that cuts across all of us. And this is in line with your vision, because as we were talking in the run-up to this event, one of the things that we all agreed on is we want a very practical, action-oriented conversation today. And as part of that, obviously you have mentioned some of these elements, but I would like to bring out the vision, specific vision that you have for decolonizing global health in specific terms. We can start by talking about who should be responsible for this process. Should it be ourselves and how we respond to those with the colonizing mentalities and approaches? Should we be saying no more often, as Dr. Kyobotungi said? So I would like us to unpack that, because as I look at the chat, which is absolutely on fire, this question has really come out very, very strongly. I can see the conversation, for example, between you, Catherine, and Shenaz about that specific question, about the roles of different stakeholders in this particular process or in this particular movement. And when you started, you mentioned that the journey ahead seems to be quite long. But what is that first step, as the Chinese say, proverbially, that a journey of 1,000 miles starts with one step? What does that first step look like for you? And maybe I can start with you, Dr. Hirsch, and then we can just have a conversation across the board, even as we look at some of the questions and comments from participants. You can go first, Dr. Hirsch.
Thank you, and thank you both to Dr. Chibutungi and Dr. Fala for your amazing inputs and presentations. Again, I'm really glad that I'm here and I'm learning a lot and taking a lot away from this. I think the first step, as Dr. Fala said, is to start saying no. But as you also very rightfully said, it's very difficult to say no. So I think for me, the first step, weirdly maybe, needs to happen outside of health, and it needs to stop tax evasion and the exploitation of foreign companies and industries that are based in, or that aren't based in Africa, that extract natural resources or labor or services from Africa and do not pay tax. Because as long as African countries do not have income do not collect corporate income tax, it becomes incredibly difficult to invest sustainably in health infrastructure, in health education, and public health services. So I think, to me, cutting down on, and I guess that links to saying no more generally, doesn't it? It means not allowing samples to leave the continent. It, as Dr. Fala said, it means saying no. It means being uncomfortable and not being cooperative, maybe from I guess a powerful European point of view, and I think we really need to become less cooperative. But yeah, ultimately, I think it means trying to stop the billions and billions of dollars that leave Africa illegally every year, that the continent could use to invest in health infrastructure and education.
Fantastic. So that's a good first step. Very practical. Let's tackle the issue of illegal and illicit financial flows so that we can have more to spare for our own public health systems. And I think that is an excellent action point and recommendation specifically directed at our public authorities, in addition to the other recommendations made. Let me just quickly mention some of the comments in the chat group. Thank you, Wegene. You say that you're enjoying the presentations, and you're asking how can Pan-African movements set its own agenda to work on the needs of Africa, and what institutional and legal frameworks are required to be set to achieve this. And maybe, Catherine, I would like, in the vein of this question of the first step, I would like to check whether you would have an insight on the institutional and legal framework that is required in order to move forward, because obviously it has to be done systematically, because the problem is systematic. So the solution will have to also be systematic. So what are your thoughts to that question?
So my thoughts really, they go back to the point that Dr. Hirsch said that towards the end of her submission. And I'll just quote about the colonization movement replicating colonial dynamics. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes I have a problem with the decolonization movement, because it still seems that thing that is coming from somewhere else and is being done for us. We are colonized, now we're being decolonized. I think I want to, of course, the movement is big and there are so many facets to it. But I always want to emphasize us as Africans and our agency. And so sitting back and saying, what is decolonization to us? And what kind of power and agency do we have? And what can we do with that agency? So I would want to take it from that perspective. Now, from the bigger issue about some of the Pan-African movements and agendas, I believe in starting from the bottom and then trying to go up, because I think you need some kind of groundswell of a critical mass of people who maybe buy into this, the need for decolonize and how it should be done. And then after that, my view is that this can sort of, percolate upwards rather than starting from the top and trying to go down. So that's really where I would approach it from. But then from an institutional perspective, going back to the point about, I mentioned the concept of institutionalizing rejection, but also trying to give some practical things about what we can do as institutions. that I think it's important to understand and define what inequality looks like to us. And then once we define that, also understand the world around us, that there's a world that is unequal, historically has been unequal, and maybe this is the moment, the decolonization movement, this is its moment. And so how do we participate and facilitate this whole movement that perhaps, so that things don't happen to us, that we are part of, providing this solution. So on a very micro scale, this is not really macro, it's on a micro scale at institutional level, define what inequality looks like to you and prepare for it. One of the things is, what are your priorities? What is your vision? Do you have a cost structure? So when you're asked that do work for $100,000, you can say, no, this does not fit in my cost structure. What are your values? And so institutionalizing rejection is really saying, okay, based on our values and our priorities and our cost, this partnership is not good for us and it's bad. And there's always a fear about rejecting things and what that could mean to you. But actually, people who do good, finance, they will tell you that sometimes it's cheaper for you to reject than to accept. Because if you reject things that are where your full costs have not been taken care of, many times you're spending your own time and money and working maybe 15 hours to fulfill things for which you're paid 8 hours. So there's a cost to you to take things where your cost structure have not been taken care of. And so that fear that if I don't take this money, what's going to happen? You might end up being better off, that you don't spend your money to subsidize a grant from a rich northern institution, and you don't spend your time sleeping at midnight every single day to deliver work for which you're not being compensated. That work, you'd better put it into something else, write those papers, define your own things, or just sleep and wake up tomorrow and do the work for which, there's small money. So like as an institution, you need to define and say, this is not acceptable and we're not accepting it. And there's always a debate about what will happen if that happens. It's not even our money, it's money from those African governments. And there's been actually a comment about this. Yes, it's not our money, it's money from the UK government, but who benefits from it? If it's coming to us, we might as well maximize what we get out of it. And if it wants to stop, as I've said, it's the same principle. I don't think if the money stopped completely, we would lose the most. I think the UK government perhaps would lose the most. So I think we should disabuse ourselves of this notion that it's all charity. It's not. All of us benefit, and perhaps we benefit the least, from this funding. So we might as well maximize, what we get out of it. So define what's a good partnership, define what is bad, and have mechanisms of saying, no, we're not accepting this. Know your worth as a researcher and as an institution. And as I've said, go back to your mission, your vision, your values, and avoid distractions. And saying no is actually a sign of strength. The more no's that you say for are exploitative and equal partnerships, your premium goes up, because people say, okay, this institution actually understands what they're talking about. But the last point I'll make is that going back to one of the points which has been raised, there are several initiatives out there that have tried to come up with principles, guidelines, toolkits about fair research contracting around mutually beneficial partnerships. They're out there. So as institutions, we need to understand that the world out there is unequal, and there are initiatives to try to make it better. Let's educate ourselves about some of these things, get some of those tips so that we are better prepared, to engage meaningfully with the world as it exists. Because if we just sit and wait, for things to be done to us, I don't know. As I've said, I want to see more moves towards how to promote the agency that we have as an Africans, and to get ourselves out of this unequal system, rather than things being done to us to dismantle unequal structures.
Well, what I'm liking is that this conversation itself is decolonized. I'm not hearing people complaining, so-and-so is doing this, so-and-so is doing this. What I'm hearing is the system is rigged, but we want to start with our agency. We want to start with ourselves. Dr. Hershey talked about dealing with illicit financial flows. Dr. Ishobutungi, you just mentioned some very fundamental aspects of how we can say no, and do so from a fundamental point of view, a foundational point of view, whereby it's not just saying no for the sake of saying no, but saying no with a clear conscience, knowing that I'm saying no because this is what I stand for, and therefore you can have a constructive conversation with the people on the other side. So it's not just no for the sake of it, but it's really a no that can actually change the paradigm, because it's a no that leads to a certain conversation with the people who are perpetrating a certain system. Especially given that there is an agenda behind, from what I'm hearing from all of you, there is a very deliberate agenda. And this is an agenda that is not new. It's an agenda of coloniality, an agenda that seeks to serve whoever is the colonial master at the end of the day. And that's why what the ecosystem has to offer here is not so important. But what you're saying is that no is a constructive no. It's supposed to lead to a shift in the agenda. So I'm liking the fact that even as we discuss, we're actually decolonizing our response and our approaches. And to that extent, I just want to throw to you, Dr. Fala, a question around our own public health authorities, our own governments. What, in your view, should be their role? Because so far we are talking about, and you've mentioned a few things that involved them, whereby you would recommend them to take a certain stand around, for example, the intellectual property rights that you felt should be enforced. You talked about the samples, the Ebola samples that were going abroad. So you've clearly interacted with that space. And I would really be curious to hear what your thoughts are specifically in regards to what governments and public authorities should do, or what their stance should be, because more often than not, they are the recipients of some of the largest public health grants from the largest public health stakeholders. What should be their approach, Dr. Fala?
Thank you very much. This is a very complicated question, understanding politics and government in Africa. But let me take a step back to what Dr. Catherine said. In this whole context or ecosystem of what we think is inequality, there's one thing we call codependency. Until in African we can realize that they world depend on each other, and you go with that mindset with the Western world that no, they need me as much as I need them. When I was leading the Ebola response, I had this famous Swedish epidemiologist, the late Hans Rosling. Hans Rosling and I will work together. He says something to me every day. Musoka, never underestimate yourself, because don't forget, the work you do in Liberia is saving the UK and the US. If you for a moment stop doing what you're doing today, the UK and US will be in problem. It's that mindset we need to have as first of us, that whatever we do in Africa, whatever is coming together for this reset, it benefits everyone equally. We depend on each other. And like Catherine said, if I'm going to get 8.5% in direct costs and you are getting 70%, if I told you no, you are going to worry more than I am going to worry. That's the concept we've got to see. What is it, 8.5%? And that leads to a key question I want to bring. First and foremost, the African need to network and help each other up. We can't be double standard. If I say no in Liberia and they came next to Sierra Leone and somebody say yes, they can get their way around. Right within the country, one scientist said no, they found another scientist who want the dollars and the cent, who want immediate gratification. Those immediate gratification undermine us in the ultimate. So one, we as a people need to network together first and support ourselves. This is what we want. That's why the framework comes about. And this will mean that there are some countries and institutions that are far advanced than the weaker ones. We need to bring them along, mentor them and build them up. We need to speak the same language, first of all. And it happened to us in real time. We had a project, I'm diverging a little bit. We had a project. It was from SEPI. It was a LASA project. My friend Christian Happy from Nigeria was leading the consortium. The Westerner came and split the consortium apart and said, we'll now work together, we'll work separate, and decided to come to each individual. Whenever I had a meeting with them, I would talk to Christian Happy and would decide on the actions. One of the things we said, our medical school did not have a master's of public health program. And we told them in no uncertain terms, one of the things that must happen from this project, you must fund the MPH program. We cannot run a medical school that don't have it, that doesn't have this program. I flew to Ghana, they tried to make an offer, and I told them, we have agreed on this matter. You must make commitment to support the MPH program, to support diaspora who have masters and PhD to be instructors. We went in circles and realized they couldn't beat us. We have an MPH program today that will be producing our first graduate. And the funding came from that LASA grant. But between the two of us, we stood up to them, and we're saying that whatever comes, it has to come to benefit the country and this program. How many times do we build our network across Africa? The West have one thing in their favor, the ability to build a network. Dr. Karanga said one example. He said, have 3 human beings together and have 2 white people and 1 black. Those 2 white should be from different continents, and let us start to have power distribution. Very soon, the 2 white people will naturally merge together against the black men. He said, but have 2 black men and a white man. Very soon, each of the black men will start to deal with the white men separately, and so he wins it. How can we build a strong merge, a common framework that is not only by thought and resolution, but by action, practical action? That no means this. If we say no, this is what we mean in simple terms. No means this to Liberia, it means this to Kenya, to East Africa, to North Africa, and we speak that word. If in our minds we realize that there is a codependent world, no world can exist without the others, and that we have power also within ourselves to make the world a better place, and we convince ourselves, very soon people will listen to us. So first of all, it's networking, coming together with a common framework, and supporting us. The strong support the weak, and we rise up. Those kind of agencies cannot help us to speak to our individual government. If I spoke as a scientist in Liberia to my government and my colleague in Kenya, my colleague in Malawi speaking the same language, our government will be forced to listen. If we watch policy document and the policy document reflect the thinking of all our scientists to our government, they will listen. So coming together and working, this is where we help our government. Because sometimes they get under pressure to compromise because funding coming to them. But if they begin to see that all of our senior scientists are speaking the same language, supporting each other, they will have to listen to us. If they understand, because all politicians want political currency. If we tell them in no uncertain scientific data, if you do the alternative and don't do what we are advising you, the disease will spread, your people will be infected. If you accept this deal from these people, this will be the problem. And they realize by accepting it, they will lose the political capital, they will listen to us. It's to work with that mindset that the politicians need political capital, and we as scientists can generate the data and advise them in terms of the global health issue that will give them that capital. And then what that can only happen fundamentally with network, we come together, we speak the language. What do we mean by a no? So that we understand in no uncertain terms, how many scientific conferences are we having that are endogenous to the continent? So that's why I like this conversation, where we have these kind of conferences that are only unique and specific to Africa that promote African scientists. Then we'll build a network where we have senior scientists to network, to mentor the weaker ones to grow up. That's fundamentally going to be our ability to build this framework across critical teams, and we support each other into it, and we don't allow ourselves to be on
a So can we officially announce, Dr. Fala, Dr. Kyobutungi, Dr. Hirsch, that we are going to facilitate the creation of this network? Because I love the idea. I love everything it stands for. I'm even surprised that such a network doesn't exist. I'm assuming that perhaps there are some regional or smaller networks here and there, but I would be surprised to hear that there is actually no network similar to what you are saying. And if there isn't, why isn't there one? Is there any kind of competition within that space? Is there anything that prevents that network from existing? Especially given that, you know, this is an issue we've lived with for decades, if I'm not mistaken. So I don't know, Catherine, what are your thoughts as to why such a network doesn't exist, and why we can't today say, even if it's about starting with the 4 of us, so be it?
I think, as I've said, this journey is a long one, and maybe Newmark is our leader in this networking. Of course, I think the issue of networking is critical. Before you know, there'll be 15 networks and everybody trying to do something. So at the end of the day, I think what is missing is the critical mass, because for you to network, you need the people who are on the same page and have the same mindset and the same vision. So the network is critical. Maybe the networking is missing leadership, and Newark, we're nominating you to lead us into this. Yeah, but I think it goes back to the question, also the issue of mandates. Different institutions have different mandates, and many times you ask yourself, who appointed you as the leader of this thing? But increasingly, you step back and say, if not us, then who? And sometimes you just go out there and you lead, or you become an activist, intentionally, because you realize that everybody's looking for leadership, and perhaps people are looking to you to lead as well. So by all means, let's network. We are ready to network and join, people who are into the same fight. We are ready to lead when the time feels right for us to lead. But yes, I think I agree a lot with what Dr. Fala said, that at the end of the day, we need to define what's important to us. And we need to do more networking, but also more sensitization. I think he made an interesting point that you reject the grant and then the partner goes just next door and they find somebody who's willing to take it. But I think the more, or most of us recognize the power and the agency that we have, and recognize our value and our contribution to this whole, research enterprise. The more of us do that, then in the end, there'll be no more partners to run to when, everyone else has said this is not good for us. So I think that those are things that are practical that we can start doing, defining ourselves, defining what we want, defining what's important to us, and then, having this sort of agreement across the board that this is not good for Africans, so we should reject it. Then with time, you start getting that critical mass I'm talking about.
Okay, well, that's fantastic. Thank you for those insights and also for that mandate. Our friends at GHDM Africa will definitely do a stellar job at doing this. I have one question for you, Dr. Hirsch, and then I would like to see if there is any of the funders here who would I was going to say, be the devil's advocate, but that would be too strong, because there are some good funders out there. There are some that are aware, that have woken up to the reality of this problem and who are trying to structurally change things. So I would like to call in Dr. Samoti if he's on the line, so that maybe he could share some insights from that perspective. But there is a specific question addressed to you from Frank Leonel, Dr. Hirsch. It's asking for you to elaborate how the progressive shift in focus from infectious diseases through nutrition to child mortality reinforce the colonial approach to global health. And maybe here it would be interesting to hear what you think about the fact that we've lived with some of the largest and most deadly infectious diseases for decades, with seemingly very, very large public health support, global public health support. But with most of them, we haven't made as much progress as, for example, we have seen with COVID-19. Obviously, we're still grappling with COVID-19. It's by far not going anywhere, and I don't want to minimize its significance. But the fact that with something like COVID-19, we've seen ramping up of capabilities and financing and mobilization over a fairly short period of time. When you look at the other infectious diseases that are still just as problematic, do you feel that that's something worth talking about? And I'm just picking up on this question because I feel perhaps this question in the context we are in today with the pandemic could speak to each other.
Yeah, definitely, I agree. I answered Frank in the Q&A box, I think, but just to summarize, I mean, the main reason why colonial governments focused on infectious diseases and then later on maternal and child health and nutrition is because in the first instance they were terrified of epidemics, because epidemics directly threatened colonial populations, so white settlers who administered the colonial empire in Africa and in other regions of the world. And then later on, colonial governments needed a healthy workforce to carry out big infrastructure projects, which were always linked to exploitation. So building the railways and all of those things, which are now quite often still held up as positive outcomes of colonialism. yeah, in order to manage those, they needed a healthy and strong workforce, but also for because of the First and Second World War, European countries drew massively on colonized populations, both in terms of labor, but also to feed their armies. I think what COVID what that reveals, but also what COVID reveals, is the issue of prioritization, right? I mean, if we could have prioritized cancer, for instance, in Africa a long time ago, and the fact that we haven't, that especially in West Africa, a lot of international funding is being spent on HIV and AIDS, even though rates are relatively low, speaks to how I guess global health management imagines and sees Africa, and I think speaks to what Dr. Falla said about this, the saviorism, the desire to save Africa and to link, I think, global health and humanitarian action to a feel-good factor that I think a lot of Europeans and North Americans need in order to want to work in the sector. It's not just about trying to improve health, it's about I'm saving someone, or I'm saving a population, or I'm saving Africa as a continent. And I think that's really important. I think now is definitely a good moment. I mean, I think every moment can be as powerful and can be as useful as we make it. So I think, yes, definitely now with COVID-19, this is a good moment to table this and to call attention to all of the injustices and the inequalities that pervade global health decision making and design, as Dr. Chubutunggi said earlier. But I think the moment is what we make it, and unfortunately, attention on COVID or on health in Africa will pass in the next few years. Like, I think these things are always very cyclical, and we can't attach our desire for change or our I guess the structures that we want to set up to global attention, because global attention is going to wane one way or another. So yeah. I don't know if that answered your question, but those are some thoughts in any case.
Absolutely. No, you've perfectly answered the question, and I think what's exciting here is that there is no better time than now to have the conversation, to move things. It will never be a perfect time. We will never have everyone agreeing on what needs to be done, but now is the time to raise the voice. And I'm actually encouraged by everything I'm hearing, and by, especially even in the chat group, by seeing how many of us are enthused, and some of us are even already doing very interesting things. For example, I'm seeing Janet Hatcher Roberts talking about the Africa Hub, which is a coalition of 7 schools of public health in Eastern Africa looking to strengthen capacity for health systems research in Africa. And FSH supported the Africa Hub during its second phase from 2011 to 2016. Now, you talked about the critical mass, Dr. Chubutunggi, and I'm just thinking about the importance, therefore, of education and of different levels of education, because we are probably talking about colonized mindsets. So it's not just about the colonizers being the perpetrators, but when you have a colonized mindset and you approach everything from that perspective, it becomes a challenge to actually change from the bottom up, because the bottom up itself has some challenges. So I don't know if there are any specific thoughts that you might have specifically regarding tertiary education or education in general, but I would think that perhaps tertiary education would be a good place to start, so that ultimately we achieve that element of the critical mass. And you know, as you answer that, Dr. Chubutunggi, you can also give us your parting shot, because I am having my eye on the clock and we are quickly moving towards our the end of our time. But if you could just come in on that issue of education as a specific stakeholder. In fact, if you can package it in the form of the top 3 things that you think should be done in that particular area, that would be highly appreciated.
That's at all, or the amount of time left. I think the issue of education, as I said, the more you really understand history and some of the points that Dr. Hash made in her presentation, the more you keep on peeling off the layers, that's when you realize how entrenched this system is. And so sometimes I look at myself and wonder, if I die at 100, what will I have done to shift the needle into this whole big thing and this big problem? But I don't think you can give up. I tend to not get daunted by this big thing and try to do things that are within my sphere of influence. And there are movements even about decolonizing education itself. People who are advocating for education, for the value that it gives to people, to the knowledge they get and their understanding of the world, rather than education for people to get employed and get jobs and work in factories. So like removing the monetary factor on education and having education as, in its own right as something that human beings need for them to relate with the world and society and all that. So, but that's still, I don't think it's a very advanced movement, but I think that's where perhaps that's where we should start. As you rightly said, if the minds are decolonized, it's very hard to start somewhere in the middle. So I'll still go back, at least within the spheres of influence where I operate, all those issues about us understanding this, but then also reaching out and forming these networks and ensuring that we all understand the world, perhaps, and what the world means and how it is us actually that have to do something. And that we shouldn't be the victims of colonization and also become the victims of decolonization.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That's really appreciated. I would like to now move on quickly to you, Dr. Fala. If you were to give 3 top points that you want people to go home with, that you want people to act on, what would those be?
Step 1 is for us to come together. Usually, great revolutions are not started by the large majority. It's started by a few persons of like-mindedness with a big heart and a big vision, who's in the right place. I think this is a good forum to start with people of like mind, to start to attack critical issues like 1, reforming our educational system so we can think in terms of Africa. Most of the great nations have read our history, whether it's South Korea, it's Morocco, they make changes when they ask themselves, what do we need as a country in terms of science? And start listening sometimes to the advisors. So the critical mass coming together, identifying the critical issues, finding a younger generation that we can mentor, finding strong advocacy arm for our government. Because at the end of the day, the larger infrastructure we have to help us to give funds, for example, for research, for education, for priority diseases still lies within our governments. Building strong advocacy arm. There is no way we can develop a disconnect from the government if we are going to decolonize Africa. They must be our partners. We have to see them as partners. How do we develop much more approachable with our government to see us that in the long run, like Christian said, they know it's actually beneficial. And like Dr. Hedge said, at the end of the day, we'll let them know the reality. Once our government, so coming together with like-minded people, building the critical mass, and that mass addressing the critical issues, and then approaching our government to see that this is in the long run in everyone's benefit. I think working like that, building partnership. And the last part is that, like you said correctly, Patrick, not all Westerners are still having a savior construct. I'm here and I got a job. I've been supported by a close friend of mine from the NIH. I have this consultants. I work for the NIH because he believes in the things I believe. So there are still people in the West, for several reasons, their conviction, think that things should be done differently. So once we build our critical mass, we find some of our partners in the North who think we should all be equal partners around the table and bring those ones together. The critical mass, sitting down with some of the partners from the North and making the governments our partners. I think if we come together as a group and begin to think through how we can create a sphere of influence, how we can do issues that will benefit us as a country from this whole global health space will be the way to go. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those wise words, and I like your insistence on both vertical and horizontal networks and partnerships, because we are in this together indeed. And this makes me want to mention something that Nafissatou Diop has just put in the group, that indeed some funders have taken steps. For example, the Innovating for Maternal and Child Health in Africa initiative, co-founded by 3 Canadian agencies, the IDRC, the Global Affairs Canada, and the Canadian Institutes for Health Research, supports 19 research teams and 2 health policy and research organizations in sub-Saharan Africa. And in each research team, the lead principal investigator is an African-based, and is in an African institution, working in collaboration with a Canadian researcher based in a Canadian academic institution, and also and a co-PI decision maker from the setting of the research involved since the design of each project. And also she goes on to talk about more on this. And I think this is a good example. It illustrates some of the things we've been talking about here, but perhaps what we are saying is that it's too little at this point. What we need is scale, what we need is momentum, what we need, as you've been talking about, Dr. Chibutungi, a critical mass. And perhaps to close us off, and I acknowledge all your fantastic comments and inputs in the chat box. It's absolutely on fire. I mean, they're coming in fast, and I see people connecting, and we have gotten even a journalist who's interested in interviewing you, Dr. Chibutungi. So you have to thank us for making you a celebrity. Yeah. So now perhaps for the final 3 points from you, Dr. Hirsch. What are the 3 points that you would like us to end with before we close?
Thank you. Feels like a lot of pressure having the last word. I think the most important point is that surrounds the politics of knowledge. I think we need to look for answers in Africa and not in Europe or North America. And I think that also relates to education. A lot of the education on the continent is still structured by curricula that are linked to European curricula in the case of former British colonies, for instance. And I think that's a really big problem. But I think it also means listening to African leaders, inviting African leaders rather than European leaders when it comes to putting on talks such as this one or conferences in general. The second point is about the politics of science. I think as a member of the diaspora, I know that a lot of African families in the diaspora are sort of very keen for their children to go into science because it's not political and it's very stable. And I would argue the opposite. I would say that science has always been political, and it needs to be political now. And I think the way in which we use and we understand health and medicine and the knowledge that the decisions that we take, as Dr. Chibutungi and Dr. Fala said, in our scientific careers have a really big impact on the politics of Africa as a continent. So that would be my second point. And I think my third point would be to be uncomfortable and be confident. So be uncomfortable in the terms of it being okay to make other people uncomfortable, to say no, to be confrontational, to not always have to be polite, to be direct, to ask for things. And I guess linked to that, be confident in the fact that as several speakers have said, and as people in the chat have said, European and North American funders need African scientists and African populations possibly more than we need them. And I think that realization, as scary as it may be, and I guess on a personal level, I'm still surprised when I get emails from high-flying medical experts asking for my opinion. And then I realize it looks good for them to work with me. And I think that realization that it looks good for funders or for people in the global north to work with Africans is a really important one, because I think it empowers us, or hopefully can empower us, to ask for things more directly and to say no when it's not advantageous to us. And I think just to end what Dr. Chibutungi said about it being cheaper to reject than to accept sometimes is a really good notion to bear in mind.
Wow, very, very interesting. And thank you. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our participants. This is by far one of the most dynamic and participatory and active sessions I've been involved in, not just in this space, but across all spaces. Clearly, there's a lot of passion. There's a lot of commitment to this conversation. We had massive participation. We had very many people registering. And that can only mean that the conversation cannot end here, especially given that it's upon us to hold ourselves responsible a few years from now when we ask ourselves, what did we do? Did we do enough at individual and collective levels? Especially, I like something that you said, Dr. Kyobutungi, that in our respective realms of influence, we all have agency, we all have a role, and it's what we do today, the little that we do today, that one step that we take, that will lead us much closer to the kind of future that we want. So thank you, everyone. I really appreciate. Have a nice evening or afternoon, wherever you are. And let's do stay in touch. The next steps are that we are going to share with you via email any write-ups, the links to the recording, so that you can share this with everyone. And obviously, we look forward to having a second edition that is going to perhaps tackle specific aspects of what we talked about, whether it's the funding side, whether it's the policy side, whether it's the education side, just to drill deeper into this conversation and perhaps get that movement or that network we were talking about taking shape and being more concrete, if you will, because the network doesn't have to be in physical form. As long as we share the same vision, and as long as we are talking, and as long as we are sharing experiences, and we are all committed to keep this fire alive, then perhaps in due course, this will not be hijacked. As you have said, some of these things tend to be over time. Thank you very much, and have a nice evening, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.